Hi, class. As you'll remember from last week, or Tuesday rather, we were discussing the development of political structures within the early Roman Republic. We had been talking about internal struggles that they had been suffering, and I was talking about the struggle of the orders, where the plebeian people were trying to kind of fight with the patricians, the aristocrats that were in power. The plebeians were trying to get some sort of political agency, to have some sort of say within their government. So the struggle of the orders was essentially the plebeians going on a variety of different strikes over a series of many years and getting a number of concessions from the patricians over time. We had discussed that in 490, the plebeians had been able to get the tribunal assembly, which was a consultative body that they were able to sit in and make suggestions and have their opinions heard in the Senate. I had discussed right before class ended on Tuesday that in 471, the plebes had been given the right to elect tribunes to send to the Senate, about 10 at a time. Now, a tribune represents the plebeian interests. The tribune takes the tribunal or the tribal assembly's suggestions and their concerns to the Senate and discusses those with the senators. A tribune can veto legislation that they see as bad for the plebes, and this veto cannot be overridden by the Senate. So it is very important. And the tribunes themselves were over time were seen as very important, to the point where there was obviously attempts on tribunes' lives. And so eventually a rule was put in place through the religious orders called sacrosanctity, where the body, the person of the tribune was considered untouchable, that they were able to intervene in fights, they could defend a pleb from a patrician, and hitting a tribune was considered a huge offense, and it was against the law. So these tribunes started to develop a lot of power. And so over time, these struggles of the orders became pretty successful. As I said, we had the tribal assembly, we have the tribunes, but over time, the plebeians are able to be made officers within the armies. They're able to intermarry with people in patrician families. And eventually, government offices are opened up to them as well. We don't see a plebe elected to the position of a consul until 367, but it's still very important, and they're able to rise within the ranks of that honoris curius, as I had talked about before. And then there are some legal reforms that we see the plebes able to get past through the struggle for the orders. And one of the most important one was done in 451, where the Roman laws were codified in what became known as the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables is the first written set of Roman laws. Originally they were these bronze plaques that were displayed in the center of the Roman Forum, and all of the laws were inscribed on them. Think the different inscriptions that we saw in the ancient Near East, how they would have important proclamations or laws chiseled on stone baluses in place within the center of cities. So think about these 12 tables as something very impressive like that. So the 12 tables reveal a lot about Roman values at this time period, and so it gives us a lot of information about them. In general, these laws were pretty harsh. Again, we don't have prisons, so the punishments have to be harsh. For example, the punishment for slander was death by clubbing. But these laws did provide the plebeians with some degree of protection against patrician oppression. The laws range from punishments for crimes, laws concerning land possession, commercial relations, creditor and debt law, slavery, family rights, and the paterfamilia, guardianship of women and minors, things that you could predict would be issues. But some of the main things we get out of these 12 tables about Roman values is the value of authority, obedience, duty, and loyalty to Rome. That's very important. Um, Eventually, by 287, plebeians are given the power to pass their own laws, which is extremely important. Um, and this right gives them a lot more say within the government themselves. So the point of all this, the significance of these changes, and I wasn't going through my slides. Okay, it was only one slide, never mind. So the 12 tables and then the tribunal assembly is given legislative powers. Okay, so the point of all of this, the struggle of the orders, is to show that the Roman Republic early on is very realistic. They're very pragmatic. They see that things aren't working. You have these conflicts between the different classes, and they made changes to adjust to it. And so out of these internal conflicts, Rome becomes more powerful and unified as a result of these reforms. So before discussing some of the external struggles that Rome faces, since we just talked about some of their internal ones, I want to discuss Roman society. These relationships that created networks within the Roman society and political systems are really important. And remember when I had said that once the Romans had declared themselves a republic, they had declared libertas from the Etruscans, they called themselves res publica, which means the public thing, the way of the people. This is really important. And so the relationships in society that make up the people are very important. And so we'll talk about the first one. I've already discussed patricians and plebeians, so I just wanted to put them out there as other names to think about. But the next important thing within Rome is the Roman family, familia. The Roman family is made up of an extended family that included all of the descendants of the eldest male in the family. In the earliest period of the Republic, all of the family farmed one tract of land that would support the entire family, and hopefully their harvest would be large enough to support not only them, but then also a surplus to then trade. And over time, this changes from the farming model to more, commercial practices to more patrician practices. But it ranges, from farmers all the way up to senators. The eldest male of the family is called the pater familia, and he had enormous power over his descendants and the other people in his family. First, in Roman law, only the pater familias has any real rights over the wealth and property within the family. Secondly, the pater familias has the power of life and death over his descendants. He could kill them, sell them into some sort of indentured servitude, or exile them from the family at a whim. His powers were so great that the most powerful Roman general, even a consul, had to obey their paterfamilias. It was in the law. The paterfamilias was expected to give his sons some certain rights, but they were expected to give their father, the paterfamilias, every penny that they earned with whatever job it was that they were doing. One historian notes that the psychological stress on an adult male whose living father often put him in intolerable situations because he had no independence. This adult male couldn't marry, couldn't buy property, couldn't run for elected office, or do anything without the father's consent. So this paterfamilia situation is very important, but it's also quite restrictive. When a child is born into a family, it would be placed at the feet of the paterfamilias, and if the paterfamilias refused to accept it, the baby would then be exposed to die out on the countryside. This is similar to the Spartan practice of if a child is not healthy, they would just expose it as well. The paterfamilias led the family in the worship of the family ancestors. Ancestors were considered guardian spirits who would look after the family interests from beyond. So it was very important to honor them in the correct way. The paterfamilias represented the family in public life, social services, public worship, governmental involvement. He would decide when his sons and daughters would marry. Usually engagements would happen at a young age, but the marriage would not happen until they were older. So we're not talking the marriage of 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds. Divorce is quite common in Roman law. And we can see that because there are these very well-established laws that talk about what to do under various circumstances dealing with divorce. And also, adult adoption was quite common. Adult adoption was one way of ensuring inheritance and political power would continue through a family. And we're going to see a number of our emperors once we start talking about the Roman Empire who were a part of a family through an adult adoption. Obedience to the paterfamilia and loyalty to the family was extremely important. Doing your duty and the unquestionable authority of the paterfamilia was very important. These were Roman virtues that were espoused in a number of places. We do also have the mater familias, who is the female head of the household. She was normally in charge of the runnings of the household and of the slaves and of the goods within the family, but not nearly as powerful as the paterfamilias. We also have another relationship within society that is very important in a number of ways. And this is the patron and client relationship. It's called the patrocinium. And this relationship hinged on an agreement between two individuals to support each other. But the partnership was an unequal one. The inferior partner was called the client, and the superior partner was called the patron. The patron agreed to provide his client with favors that would help him, like maybe give him some money to help him through hard times, represent the client in court, help him with his political career. And in return, the client promised to visit his patron every day, to go with the patron to important events, to support his patron's interests when he voted in the assembly, and to follow the patron's lead in all matters. This patron-client relationship was generally a moral obligation. You know, remember we talked about fides, this faithfulness. This is really important because you want this relationship of faithfulness between the two partners, and that ensured that it was a partnership back and forth. Over time, this tradition of client-patron relationships can actually start being inherited by sons, and eventually there's a whole history of a relationship between families. And I mentioned this fides, this faithfulness. Fides is what tied society together. It was the social glue of Rome. Externally, the relationship, it was also used externally in the relationship between Rome and her allies, with this idea of a faithful relationship and being true to the partnership. Back to the patron-client relationship, though, the client himself might actually be a patron to others. So he might meet with his clients earlier in the morning and then go over to his own patron's house thereafter to sort of show up and show support. One Roman poet noted that unimportant men were those who made visits but received no visitors. Important patrons might have a line of clients waiting at his door starting at dawn that stretched around a city block. And we should remember the importance of having these clients is because the more clients someone had, the greater their prestige, the greater their authority, the larger support network that they could pull from. And so I'm going to talk now about some Roman values within society. And these values are really important because these values tell us what the Romans think made them a strong society, what gave them their strength. And we've talked about libertas before, that is liberty from kingship, that is their republican ideals. And then we also have virtus, which is the Latin word for man is vir. And with virtus, it essentially means manliness, manly self-control. The idea that men had more intellect and could use that to control their reactions. Better access to reason makes these men better at controlling themselves, which is why women need guardians and people need to look after their interests. So this virtus was very important. Think of it a little bit as arete in the Greek custom. The next really important value is pietas, which is how a good Roman shows respect and affection for the gods, for their parents, for one's elders, and even for one's children and friends, and to one's country, this piety, if you want to think of it that way. Romans were always concerned about this value. They were always complaining that the younger generation didn't share enough piety. They weren't sufficiently pious enough. Um, it's this idea that kids these days have no respect. So kids these days have no pietas. Um, it's an interesting one, but it's also this idea that you're working towards the greater good. This respect towards your country. So remember we talked about those foundation myths, the one with Aeneas from Troy, when he left the Queen of Carthage, when he left Dido. He was doing it because he had this pietas. He had great piety for the greater good, and the greater good was the knowledge that he was going to establish a great kingdom in Italy. So he was giving up something important for the greater good. The next really important value is gravitas, and this is seriousness, acting with appropriate seriousness in a situation, especially when it concerns the obligations of the state. We have another one, which is nobilitas, which is kind of like ambition. And it's this idea that your nobility isn't necessarily based on birth, but on accomplishment, on service to the state, living up to the greatness of your ancestors. There's a lot of pressure put on people to be ambitious and to make a name for themselves. This brings a positive value to your family. It also helps bring out the best in people for the benefit of the state. A lot of patricians felt that this nobilitas put a lot of pressure on them when they were bearing a noble name to live up to that noble name and accomplish great things. Another important value is mos majorum, which is in the custom of the ancestors. And this is essentially showing piety towards the importance of tradition and customs to the Romans. You can have respect to the customs of the ancestors in terms of politics, religion, the way that families are run. It's essentially a way of preserving Roman values and customs. It's interesting, that the Romans put so much emphasis on their values, but when we look back at their primary sources and the own things that they write about themselves, we can see that they don't believe that they're living up to their own ideals, that they're violating these norms that they hold so high. Even though they know they're not living up to these ideals and these values, but they still value them so much. And so it says a lot about what they think of their society, at least. They believe that modesty and restraint are good things, but clearly excess is a problem. Another value, it's not really a value so much, but war is important. The idea that the Romans were founded by sons of Mars, the god of war. The Romans have this romanticized idea of themselves as being these farmer soldiers. They work in the field, but then they're able to be these capable fighters at the drop of a hat. It's really similar to our Athenian society, our city-state of Athens view of themselves, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so the next topic we're going to talk about is Roman religion. Now, I went over Greek religion pretty good, I think, several weeks ago, and I'm just going to kind of say a blanket statement here is that the Roman religion is essentially Greek religion, but with different names given to the various gods and goddesses. So I'm not going to go over it too much. But what's interesting about Rome, and we're going to see this as we talk more about Rome's interaction with other areas as they conquer them, is that Rome has no problem with adopting the gods of the areas that they conquer. They just sort of invite them all into their pantheon and just worship everyone. And it's pretty interesting. So they adopt the Egyptian gods, they adopted some of the Etruscan gods, they adopt some of the Carthaginian gods, and all of these gods that they adopt along with their Roman gods, they all end up getting these big temples in the Roman Forum. So we'll see the temple to Jupiter, who is Zeus, the king of the gods, and to Juno, his wife, which is Hera. We see temples to Mars, who is Ares, temples to Venus, the goddess of love, who we know as Aphrodite. Venus is that mother of Aeneas, and she's very highly honored as an ancestor of Rome also. The gods don't model the kind of family fidelity, that faithfulness that the Romans value so much, but that doesn't seem to change the fact that they still worship them. So there's some important figures within Roman religion that I want to talk about. First off, they do have a college of priests, and this college of priests essentially makes sure that they're training up priests of certain gods in the correct ways, and in these divine knowledge. And one of these divine knowledges is the tool of divination, which is understanding the signs that the gods are sending. Remember when I was talking about Romulus and Remus, and how Remus was claiming that more birds had flown over his city, and therefore the gods were valuing his city more? Well, this is actually a term for that is called augur, right here, augur, which is understanding the divine flight pattern of birds, and understanding when those patterns mean warnings or when they mean signs from the gods. It's pretty interesting. Another type of art similar to this is aurispis. Aurispis is when a priest reads the animal entrails to divine the god's messages. So different colorations and spots on the organs mean different things. And a lot of this has to do with knowing which animals to sacrifice when, and to which gods. So it's a whole art that they teach in this college of priests. And it's all about keeping the gods happy and understanding their signs so that you can be sure that you are doing the right things to keep those gods happy. Romans want to make sure that they're sacrificing in the right way in order to make sure that the gods stay on Rome's side. They want to make sure that the gods are on their side in a particular war, and so they want to make sure that they can read the signs for that. These priests make sure that they're performing rituals correctly, and making sure that they're calling out the right gods at the right times and asking for the right assistance. There is a high priest over all of the colleges and over all of Rome, and they are known as Pontifex Maximus. And they are very important because they essentially speak for the religious element within Rome. There's also a group of women that are extremely important within Roman religion, and these are known as the Vestal Virgins. I've got a picture right here of those Vestal Virgins. And these are women who are selected as young girls to devote themselves to the temple and to Vesta's flame. Vesta is a lower god, but she's still very important in this religion. A Vestal Virgin gives 30 years of her life in service. And having your daughter chosen to be a Vestal Virgin is a very high honor, and it says a lot about your family's honor and standing. What the women usually do is they cultivate and tend to this flame of Vesta. The flame can't go out. Vesta is she is the goddess of the hearth, excuse me. And so if that flame goes out, it's like the flame of the family, of the soul of society goes out. And the Vestal Virgins are very important, and they last well into the Christian period of the Roman Empire. There's a number of religious festivals I want to talk about a little bit. First off, we have Lupercalia, which is a fertility festival. This is when there are dogs and goats that are sacrificed at the beginning of the festival. And during the festival, we have these nude priests that run around. They're called the Luperci, and they perform these rituals of purification by whipping spectators with these leather thongs that they have made from the sacrificed animals at the beginning of the festival. And this is a way of promoting fertility. It's a little crazy, but that's what you can see in this image down here at the bottom of the slide, is those leather thongs, and they're whipping people as part of this festival. We do also have the festival of Parilia, and this is celebrated annually around April 21st in honor of the god and goddess Pales, who are the protectors of the flocks and herds. And the festival is basically a purification rite for herdsmen, beasts, and other herds that the Romans have in that area. And it was a festival that was celebrated very early on in the Roman Etruscan period. The Vestal Virgins are very important in this. They open the festival by distributing pieces of straw and ashes and blood of sacrificed animals. And this is sort of seen as a ritual cleaning. They anoint people, they anoint the herds and the herdsmen, and they offer simple foods in sacrifice to the gods. Celebrants jump over a bonfire 3 times to be purified. And it's a really festive time period. It's kind of like an open air festival that happens. In a later tradition, it was said that it was on April 21st that Romulus began building the city of Rome. So they kind of connect it back to their old foundation myths. And then we have another festival I want to talk about, which is called Saturnalia. And this is the most popular of the Roman festivals, and it's dedicated to the Roman god Saturn. And it's celebrated around December 17th to the 23rd. And it's believed to be a precursor to Christmas, which a lot of Christian holidays are based on pagan festivals previously. So during this time period, all work and business is suspended. Slaves are given a temporary freedom to say and do what they like. And there are certain moral restrictions that are eased during this time period. The streets have kind of it's almost a Mardi Gras feel to it, sort of this Mardi Gras madness. There's a mock king who is chosen, and the seasonal greeting that people say to one another, it is Saturnalia, Saturnalia, Saturnalia to you, a thing. But the closing days of Saturnalia was known as this really important time. And there was this custom of making and presenting candle images of people. So they would take these candles and they would mold them into images of fruit or of different statues, and you would go around and give them to people as sort of a present, kind of gift giving process of the Christmas season as well. So it's these really interesting festivals that the Romans have. But we're also now going to turn to a slightly more violent topic, although I suppose these festivals do involve quite a bit of sacrifice and whipping people with thongs, so I guess it's somewhat violent as well. But we're going to turn to the external struggles that Rome goes through in its way to expand its empire. So we have a number of these external struggles that Rome goes through. We have the expansion over the entire peninsula of the Italian peninsula, and then the expansion over the Western Mediterranean world, which become known as the Punic Wars. And then we have expansion over the Eastern Hellenistic world, which is essentially Alexander the Great's lost empire. So for about 350 years, Rome goes through sort of this period of constant warfare where it's just slowly expanding its empire to a larger and larger field. And we're going to talk about each one of those different stages now. So stage 1 is expansion within Italy and the unification of the peninsula. So while working on its internal workings, Rome is also a growing power in the Italian peninsula, ever since it had thrown off the yoke of Etruscan rule in 509 BCE. So if Rome wanted to expand within the peninsula, it had to face all of those other tribes that were living in the peninsula. Those tribes who were living in the Apennines Mountains, those were the hill peoples we mentioned before, are definitely a less civilized group of people. They usually have a loose tribal organization of some kind, and there's just constant warfare going on between these different tribes. And so eventually Rome allies with some other Latin cities to defeat these hill peoples. So in 493, all of these Latin cities come together to form a military alliance called the Latin League. And it was aimed primarily at 2 groups of enemies, the Etruscans and the Etruscans in the north, and then the barbarian tribes in the mountainous regions near Latinum. So at first, Rome was an equal partner with these other Latin cities within this Latin League. But gradually over time, their skill and toughness of their armies brought them to a leading role within the alliance. And with this alliance, they're able to defeat the Etruscans in the north. And so by 396, we see the Etruscans completely defeated. But as Rome is getting very excited about this defeat of the Etruscans, something really tragic happens. In 390, there is an invading group of nomadic Gauls from the Germanic areas north of Italy. They come down through the Italian Alps and essentially take Rome by surprise. Um, there was sort of this negotiation that was happening between the Romans and the Etruscans, and they end up in this battle with this Gaulish tribe. And due to poor leadership and communication, the Gauls were able to defeat the Romans in this battle that was only 13 miles from Rome itself. And Rome didn't take these Gauls very seriously, and so they had brought most of their troops out, and they didn't leave a defensive group in Rome to stay behind. So Rome is left virtually defenseless, and the Gauls are able to cross that 13 miles very quickly, in which they enter the city of Rome and they start sacking the city. So there are some soldiers that had remained behind, and some men of fighting age who had not been part of the army. And these all kind of group together, and they take they go up to the Capitine, the Capitoline Hill, and they kind of barricade that a little bit. They have whatever weapons they could find, whatever food they could find, and the Gauls end up sieging them there in a siege that lasts for about 7 months. Meanwhile, the rest of the population of Rome has either fled and they're living out in the countryside trying to keep away from the Gauls, or they're part of the city that's still living there and dealing with the Gauls during this 7 month period, and it's not a good time. Both groups, both the Gauls and the people who are being besieged on Capitoline Hill, they go through different stages of famine. There's a malaria outbreak that really affects both sides. Eventually, they do come to an agreement to end the siege, where the Romans agree to pay the Gauls about 1,000 pounds of gold to do a peaceful withdrawal and leave the Italian peninsula for good. According to the historian Livy, who was writing in the first century AD, so about 400 years after, no, almost 500 years after this, according to him, that when the gold was weighed, the Gauls produced heavier false counterweights, so they were rigging the scales. When the Romans complained about this, the chief of the Gauls apparently said, "Woe to the vanquished," and threw his own sword on the scales to make it even heavier. So the Gauls left the city with their 1,000+ pounds of gold, but they were stopped and defeated by a Roman army that during that 7 months had been able to kind of regroup and assemble during that siege, and the gold was returned to Rome. So it ended up not being anything, but there was a lot of suffering that happened during those 7 months in Rome. And what resulted of this Gaulish siege is that the Romans realized that the defenses that they had at that moment was just not enough. So over time, we start to see 7 miles of wall being built around Rome. These walls are 12 feet thick and 24 feet high. And this was to prevent another invasion. Also, I doubt Remus would have been able to step over these walls. So what follows after this Gaulish invasion and then the Roman defeat of them is a series of many more wars that are very successful for the Romans. So they turn south to go against Rome's former allies, the Latin League. Even though the Latin League had helped them defeat the Etruscans and to defeat those mountain tribes, Rome turns against them and defeats a coalition of these Latin cities in what's known as the Great Latin War that goes from 340 to 338. And eventually Rome conquers all of these cities. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what they do with them once they're conquered. But once Rome has taken care of their eastern border, their northern border, they turn south. And if you remember, the people who are living in the southern part of Italy are Greek settlements, the area that's known as Magna Graecia. But by 267, Rome was able to defeat all of those Greek city-states and really control the entire span of the Italian peninsula. Uh, these Greek colonies were still very Greek, as I said, like they really carried on that Hellenistic culture, even though they weren't physically linked to the home city that had colonized them originally. And when the Romans take over these Greek cities, a lot of that Greek culture and that Hellenism really kind of starts trickling into the Roman society. And we do start to see some Roman writers and patricians start complaining about these Grecian ways and these foreign ways. Very similar to the way that the Macedonians were upset by Alexander the Great, kind of taking on those Persian cultural ways. So we see a little bit of suspicion with foreign people's behaviors and cultures being introduced into society. And we're going to see that this isn't the last time that the Romans are concerned about too much Greekness in Roman society. So you remember when we were talking about these foundational myths, and the foundational myth of Romulus and Remus was one that said that Rome only fights in defense of itself. This was an important thing. So how does Rome justify all of this invasion and war? I mean, those tribal colonies, those tribal peoples in the hills weren't attacking them. The Greek settlements in Magna Graecia weren't attacking them. So how do they justify this? Again, remember, Romans love their virtues, but they don't always live up to them either. So in order to ensure that Rome is only going to war with the blessings of the gods, the College of the Priests engage in a religious ceremony called evocato, which is this calling out of the gods. And they make sure that before Rome goes into battle, that they do this evocato ceremony that makes this strong connection between the gods, and so that they're declaring war in a proper way to make sure that the gods understand that Rome is going to war for the right reasons. And theoretically, Rome can, as I said, only go to war in defense of themselves or in defense of an ally. But what they start doing is they come up with this idea of a preemptive strike. So essentially, they start justifying imperialism as a preemptive defensive move. So defensive imperialism is how Rome justifies all of these wars that they engage in, and how they're really just in defense of Rome. So it's this defensive imperialism that's really important to justifying Rome's actions at these times. Romans like to tell themselves that they were going to war to achieve security against these outside threats. So it's this preemptive defensive strike that justifies what they're doing. So once Rome has the entire peninsula of Italy under its thumb, and as you can see from the slide, there's this gradual progression of them taking over different lands. How are they able to, A, take over all of this land, and then B, keep it? So there's a number of innovations that Rome does that kind of helps them along this way. So I'm going to talk about their military innovations first. So how was Rome able to be so successful militarily speaking? So all males 18 years or older are considered citizens of Rome if they participate in the military. So there's this military obligation to serve if you want to have a say in your government. And then all of the areas that are conquered are also expected to participate in the Roman army because they are then offered limited citizen rights within Rome that are granted to their areas. And so as Rome conquers more and more areas, they've got more and more men to fill up their armies. So their army is growing larger and larger in size. So every victory means a larger army for the next war they go against. And Rome's military and their farmer soldiers are really important to this success. They're really important to this expansion because they become kind of a well-oiled machine. Now, originally in the early empire or the early Roman Republic, they still fought in that Greek hoplite phalanx fashion. Remember, that's this large group that fights kind of in a square, and you're supporting all of the people in front of you, and your shield is protecting the person to your left, and the person to your right is protecting your side, and kind of this huge fashion. But these giant formations of men could be made up of 8,000 soldiers sometimes. and they're not really that flexible or maneuverable. They're powerful, but they're not that maneuverable. So Romans come up with a little bit of trial and error, a new system where they break the phalanx down into smaller units, and they break them down into what they call legions. And that is made up of about 4,000 to 5,000 men in each one of these phalanx legions. And then those legions are broken down even to even smaller units of 500 soldiers called cohorts. And then those are broken down even more into smaller units of 100 soldiers, and those are called centuries. So these smaller units are able to be deployed and move around with a lot more flexibility and quickness than this giant 8,000 person phalanx normally would be able to. And they're fighting, a lot of their enemies are very disorganized. They're not as professional as the Roman army is. And so this professionalism on the Romans' part and their organization makes it so they can really easily defeat some of these Roman foes that they're facing against. So there's also diplomatic innovations that the Romans use to keep these newly conquered areas in line, keep them faithful to the Romans. So how are they able to assert themselves over these newly conquered territories? The Romans employ a number of tactics that ensure that these newly taken areas remain loyal. Typically, when Rome defeated a city or an area, the first thing that they would do is annex about 1/3 of those conquered lands. Now, they would keep those lands and they would grant that to their own Roman soldiers to own as civilians when the war is over. And so this ensured that a lot of these Roman soldiers then moved out of Rome into these conquered areas and would live amongst those people. And as a result of this movement, this type of planned colonization, very similar to what Alexander the Great did with his cities of Alexandria and leaving his Greek retired soldiers behind him. The result of these Romans moving into these areas and taking over some of those lands means that you've got Roman citizens all over Italy that are living that Roman life, that are loyal to Rome, and they're spreading that idea amongst those people that they're living with. And it kind of begins this process of Romanization, that kind of this colonization that helps to spread not only the Roman people, but their cultures and their values to these newly conquered areas. So Romanization becomes really important to keeping these newly conquered areas feeling connected to Rome. They also, with this settlement process, is they assimilate these conquered towns. They don't kill every single person that's in them, and they don't enslave every single person that's in these cities. Rome is really about making more citizens. Rome is a really inclusive empire. They're not exclusive. They want more citizens. It's this idea, the more the merrier with Rome. So these conquered peoples are then granted sort of this ally status, where they're subordinate allies. This, that patron-client system is what Rome is putting into place with these conquered areas. Rome is the patron, and the conquered area is the client. So there's loyalty that's expected to be shown back and forth. And as Rome continues to spread, being able to say, look, we've conquered these areas and they're doing fine. That's a great way of convincing other places to, instead of fighting, to just agree to be allies of Rome. And so it makes it easier, the more allies Rome has, to continue more of that peaceful conquering. And as I said, sometimes Rome doesn't need to conquer an area because those people see that there are more benefits to being an ally with Rome and having those limited Roman citizenship rights than it is to have absolute independence and fight against Rome. And so Rome just makes it far more lucrative to be an ally than it is to be an enemy. And they did this by offering this limited Roman citizenship. So they would stress that there's advantages to being part of the Roman Empire, giving them a say in the way that the state runs, giving them rights for trading and removing tariffs from trade back and forth, that sort of thing. The Romans really do expect loyalty and faithfulness from these newly conquered areas, though. Um, and they would offer limited self-government. The Romans aren't planning on micromanaging every aspect of these taken cities, but there's an expectation that in return for this limited self-government, very similar to the Persians, if you want to make a comparison there, um, they demand absolute loyalty, and they demand that these new allies provide soldiers for Rome whenever Rome requests. So loyalty and soldiers in exchange for many of the benefits that come with being part of the Roman Empire. So it's kind of a tit for tat. It's a good bargain on both sides. The allies get protection and fair treatment, and the Romans get vast numbers of soldiers to assist them in their conquests. Uh, Other things that the Romans do is that I mentioned this before with religion, but they absorb some of those local deities that these allies have, and so they're incorporating them into that pantheon. And it's sort of this way of showing those new allies that, look, your gods fit in really well. Why don't you? So it's kind of this way of doing that. But there is also this other thing. It's not really so much as diplomacy as it is just good practice. But the Romans, just like the Persians, start a process of road building across Italy and then eventually across their entire empire. This network of roads is created and maintained to make the movements of troops much swifter and the movement of supplies much easier. So initially, it's all about moving the military around. But eventually, it really becomes helpful in administration as well, with communication, the transportation of taxes and money. Eventually, we start seeing mile markers being developed and roadsides being put up on these roads. Roman politicians actually start funding the building of these roads because Roman politicians want to be seen by the plebeians, by the people who vote, as patronizing Rome, as making Rome better. And so building these road projects makes them seem more favorable in the plebeians' eyes. So it's this patronism of Rome helps with that as well. And eventually the Romans bring their own road building materials with them as they're expanding into these new areas. And so they're just creating roads as they move along. So it's really an efficient process. So we're going to talk about the second stage of Roman expansion. They've taken all of Italy now, but that's not enough. So we're going to see what comes next. So the next step in Roman expansion is what's known as the Punic Wars. By 265, Rome was the master of the entire Italian peninsula. And that mastery, as I just discussed, was accomplished through a combination of military conquests and mutually beneficial alliances. Alliances that brought those conquered cities under Roman authority, but also within a mutually beneficial relationship. However, the real challenges to Rome's dominance start to occur between the years 264 and 146 BCE. In 264, Rome began a series of wars that were to expand its power outside of Italy proper and into the rest of the ancient wars. And these wars are known as the Punic Wars. And it's in these wars that the Romans faced their most formidable enemy, the city of Carthage. Carthage, if you remember from previous lectures, Carthage was one of the cities that had been built on the northern coast of Africa by the Phoenicians. As a Phoenician city, Carthage was a very active participant in trade and commerce. But by 264, Carthage had established a very lucrative commercial empire that included much of North Africa, parts of Spain, part of Sicily, and many of the islands in the Mediterranean. And as Rome continues to expand on its peninsula, it becomes more and more inevitable that Rome and Carthage would eventually come into conflict. And we'll see that they actually do. So the First Punic War started in 264 and it lasted until 241, so almost 20 years. It all started when an issue came up with Sicily. So in 264, Carthage already controlled the western portion of the island of Sicily. If you look at the slide over here on the map, you can see Sicily here. So Carthage had the western part, which was very close. Carthage is right here. So they had control of the western part of Sicily and had begun to kind of threatened the cities on the eastern coast to bring them under their power as well. And one of the cities on the eastern coast, called Messina, was a large city on that eastern side, and it was allied with some of the Greek cities in southern Italy. And those Greek cities were, of course, obviously allied with Rome by this point because Rome controlled all of the peninsula. So these cities in Sicily that were coming under this Carthaginian pressure essentially asked Rome for help. Uh, so Rome tells us that that's the reason they did it, but they probably wanted to make sure that Carthage didn't take over all of Sicily because that would have undermined and threatened Rome's ambitions to take Sicily themselves. So kind of a, you want to say it this way, but it's really the other way. But anyways, regardless, uh, Rome decides to go to war in defense of their allies, of course, this imperial defensiveness. So Rome has this great army, as I said. All of these allies contributed to it. But Carthage has a great navy, but not so much a great army. And again, remember the wars between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian Wars? Athens has a great navy, and the Peloponnesian League under the Spartans have a great army. And because they're just not fitting properly, the war just never decides itself. And so they're fighting sea battles, they're fighting on land. One wins, the other wins, and it's just kind of a stalemate until Carthage starts being a little bit better at on the sea than the Romans are on land. And this is because they're under the command of a guy named Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar Barca. And we're going to know him as the father of Hannibal, who is going to come up in the second Punic Wars. So this man, Hamilcar Barca, is leading the Carthaginian navy, and they are having a number of victories. And so eventually the Romans are really forced to innovate. And this kind of desperation on their side comes up with this amazing new naval technology. And you can see it here on the slide. It's called the corvus. And essentially what it is, it's a grappling hook that is affixed to the front of a Roman trireme ship. And this grappling hook is swung down so that it pierces the deck of another ship, and it essentially grapples that ship to the Roman ship, allowing those Romans to then board the other ship. And so this new technology is a huge deal. And so in 241, with this new weapon, the Romans are able to win major naval victory after another. And as a result, after 20 years of war, Carthage essentially just surrenders out of exhaustion. This is a big war. And again, remember, that's kind of how it happened with the Peloponnesian War as well. Athens and Sparta were both exhausted, but Spartans won on the ocean or on the sea after having made some modifications and gotten themselves a navy. So even though Rome kind of won by default, they still really imposed very harsh peace treaty terms on the Carthaginians. So Carthage is forced to pay a very large reparations, essentially. They're forced to surrender their possessions in Sicily, as well as the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. And they are forced to pay Rome a great deal of money. But after the war, Carthage, so after this war, Carthage is worn out. But the things that they gave up are not the only things that made their empire great in the first place. Remember, they still had possessions in Spain. So Carthage tries to compensate for the loss of Sicily and these other islands by really reestablishing itself in Spain. And the reason Spain is important because at this time it has lots of silver and gold deposits. And so the mining industry in Spain at this part is really huge to Carthage's well-being. It also has a lot of productive farmland as well, so it's really fertile too. So the provincial leader who was put in charge of Spain after this first Punic War was Hannibal, that son of Hamilcar Barca, that Carthaginian naval commander who was doing well, but then eventually lost the first Punic War. But Hannibal becomes the governor of Spain. And we're kind of told it's sort of a legendary tale that Hannibal had grown up with this deep and profound hatred for Rome. You know, they made his dad look bad. And legend has it that as a boy, Hannibal had sworn to his father that he would avenge the Carthaginian loss of Sicily and destroy Rome once and for all. Any questions? So there is this minor conflict that happens in the Spanish Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, between some troops of Rome and Carthage, kind of a land border war. But this small thing sparks the Second Punic War. And that starts in 218 and it lasts until 201 BCE. And looking back at the war, you can tell that Hannibal had a twofold strategy. The first one was to defeat the Romans, simple enough. And the other one was to undermine the Roman system of alliances. So where Rome is getting all of those soldiers from, if you undermine that, Rome doesn't have that big army, making them even more easy to defeat. So Hannibal calculated that if he defeated the Romans, their allies would rise up in revolt and join him in a major offensive against Rome. And at the same time, he also understood that Carthage would be unable to attack from the south because Rome's possession of Sicily and that powerful fleet that they had developed would block that. So Hannibal decides the only way to enact this twofold strategy is to attack Rome from the place they would expect the least, which is from the north. So in the spring of 218, Hannibal moves 30,000 troops and 60 war elephants from Carthage across North Africa into Spain. I'm going to progress this slide real quick so I can show you. So he marches from Carthage, sails over to Spain, and marches up along the coast, up through kind of present-day France, but it would have been called Gaul at this time. He marches them up through here. There's a number of battles he kind of engages in, but eventually he's marching them across this mountain range, the Alps. So he marches his 30,000 troops and his 60 war elephants across the Alps in the spring. And his army is made up of not just Carthaginians, but also some of their allies. And that's including a very professional Numidian cavalry that are just very swift, and they have a different type of horse, and they have a different type of saddle that allows them as really good archers on horseback. So attacking from the north was not something Rome had anticipated, nor had they ever fought an army of elephants before. So Hannibal used nature and the environment and his knowledge of the enemy to augment the strength of his smaller army. So the first major battle we're going to discuss occurs in December of 2018. It happens in December 218, and it's the Battle of Trebia River. Hannibal, at this battle, slaughters 2/3 of the Roman army that had arrived to fight him. The Romans had outnumbered the Carthaginians by about, well, the Romans had 42,000 soldiers. And they had outnumbered, obviously, the Carthaginians had about 30,000. So a huge amount of outnumbering. We're told by Roman historians that at least 15,000 Romans died at this battle. And there was possibly another 12,000 that had been taken prisoner. The Carthaginians probably suffered about 5,000 casualties in this war. But this defeat of the Roman army really kind of makes the Romans think back to that sack that, you remember the Gaulish barbarians that came down through the Alps and sacked Rome and sieged them for 7 months. It really kind of brings back that trauma to the Roman citizens. And so they start taking Hannibal more seriously. So in the spring of 217, we see the Romans and Hannibal and the Carthaginians come into battle again. And this is at the Battle of the Lake of Trasimene. And Hannibal managed to ambush and absolutely obliterate 2 entire legions. So remember, those legions are about 5,000 to 4,000. So that's max 10 to 8,000 troops. And every single one of them was killed. So even the consul who was leading that army was killed. We're told this by Roman historians, so we kind of have to take it as fact at that point. So this is awful, a huge defeat. A couple of months later, well, more than a couple of months later, in August of 216, the Carthaginians again are facing off against a new army that Rome was able to raise from amongst their allies, remember. And this is the Battle of Cannae, or Cain, excuse me. The Battle of Cain happens in August of 216. And Rome brings everything. They bring about 86,000 men. And at this point, because Hannibal had kind of pressed some of those soldiers he had taken in battle, some of those prisoners of war, he had pressed them into service, but he had also gotten some of those Roman allies to turn coats and join his side. So Hannibal had about 50,000 troops at this point, and almost all of the Roman army was defeated. And they say about 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers were defeated in this battle, and it is known as the worst defeat the Romans have ever experienced in their entire republic to empire. So the worst defeat ever. Um, and this defeat itself, I'm going to go back to our map real quick here. This defeat was right around here, which is very, very close to Rome. Well, it's not that close, but it's close enough to Rome. And that, again, makes the Romans very uncomfortable with how close Hannibal is to his troops. So the Romans start to realize that they obviously can't defeat Hannibal on the battlefield. And they start employing some different tactics. And at the same time, Hannibal has proven very victorious in a number of these battles. And so he's able to start picking off some of those allies of the Romans bit by bit. He's got a bunch of Celtic tribes from northern Italy that switch over to his side after they've demonstrated that they can defeat the Romans. And part of those, that Latin League that the Romans allied with and then fought against and then took over, some of them turn and help Hannibal as well, but not all of them. Remember, the Romans made it very clear and showed that there were many benefits to being a part of the Roman Republic. And so a lot of those allies did not turn, they did not break their faithfulness, their loyalty to Rome. So Hannibal wasn't able to get as many of these allies picked off as he wanted. So what Rome does is, to prevent their army from having to face Hannibal in the battlefield again, what they start doing is just harassing his army from behind, attacking it when they can. So when they know the landscape, they kind of attack like those narrow passes, these hit and run skirmishes. And some of their allies start doing the same thing. And so for almost a decade, Hannibal is kind of chased around the Italian interior, kind of trying to find the Roman army, but at the same time being attacked from the rear by the Roman army at the same time. So he never actually makes it to the gates of Rome. So Rome never actually gets sacked again like they had by the Gauls back in 396. And the reason Rome is able to do this, why they're able to keep bringing men into the field, is that they have so many options. They have so many allies that they're able to kind of pull these men. And one of those Roman values is this idea of sacrificing yourself for your country, doing all that you can for your country. And so it was seen as one of the best things you could die for, was to die for your country. And actually, the Romans are able to pull some of the Carthaginian allies away from them. Remember those Numidians I had said with the really excellent cavalry skills? They actually turn and support the Romans after a while. But Rome realizes that this can't go on forever. And so they decide that they have to take this fight out of the Italian peninsula before it gets completely destroyed. So they start fighting against Carthaginian forces in Spain. They start fighting them in the various islands in the Mediterranean. And then finally, in 202, the Roman general Cornelius Scipio decides to launch a fleet and land a Roman army outside of the city of Carthage itself. And landing that army outside of Carthage is what forces Hannibal to leave Italy. He has to go back and defend his city. Again, he's got a huge army with him, and that means there's not that many soldiers left in Carthage. So landing those Roman troops outside of Carthage is what pulls Hannibal and his war elephants and his amazing troops out of the Italian peninsula. So this battle happens in 202, the Battle of Zama, and Carthage loses. So it's the first battle that Carthage loses against the Romans, and it's the battle that matters. So they were winning the battles, but they lost the war. So Carthage is forced to surrender to Rome for a second time. What Rome imposes on them in this treaty is that they lose all of the lands that they held outside of the African coast. So those lucrative silver and gold mines in Spain, those are Rome's now. They are forced to destroy their entire navy fleet. They're only allowed 10 ships, specifically 10 ships. And then they're also forced to pay huge reparation payments, triple what they had to pay after losing the first Punic War. And over time, Romans start getting very concerned because Carthage is making those payments, those reparation payments, very quickly. And Rome is very suspicious of how quickly they're able to do this. And now that Roman general who decided to land that Roman army outside of Carthage, that Cornelius Scipio, he is given the title of Africanus because he is seen as the hero of this battle. So he is now known as Cornelius Scipio Africanus, and he becomes a pretty important politician in Roman politics after this point. So why is it that Rome lost every battle, but yet still managed to win the war? What historians can point to is that it was the durability of Rome's system of alliances that they had within the Italian peninsula that enabled them to continue to put men in the field and finally to defeat the Carthaginians in that Battle of Zama. And so it was that diplomatic policy of bringing these conquered cities into a patron-client system, this loyalty, this fides system with Rome, so that those alliances became the thing that saved Rome. So it's very important. So we're going to talk about the Third Punic War now. Remember how I said that the Romans were pretty suspicious of how quickly Carthage was able to make repayments for their reparations? Well, they only continued to get more and more paranoid about that situation. And it didn't help much because we had this guy, a writer, he was a historian, he's a moralist. His name was Cato the Elder. Cato the Elder was the censor for the Senate. Remember, the censor not only records what happens in Rome, but he's also in charge of censorship and allowing different plays to be performed, or this book can't be published. So he can really kind of determine what sort of propaganda is being put out there. And he is really concerned about Carthage rising back up and there being a third Punic War. And so he's constantly publishing propaganda about this threat of Carthage. And eventually that concern just sort of boils up in Rome. And Rome eventually decides that they're not really going to wait for an excuse. They'll find, and they're not going to wait for provocation, for something to defend themselves against. They're just going to find a reason to go in and go after Carthage for the last time and just defeat them thoroughly. So in 149 BCE, which is about 50 years. So it's been 50 years since they defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War. But Rome is still really concerned about the threat of Carthage. So Carthage and one of their neighbors, the Numidians, are kind of having a bit of a battle, territorial war in North Africa. And because those Numidians had allied with Rome during the latter part of the Second Punic War, Rome was able to say that Carthage had broken part of the treaty by attacking an ally of Rome. And so Rome uses this excuse to raise an army that they send to Carthage once again. And with the navy that they have, because remember, they forced Carthage to destroy their navy, but they also took some of those ships too. So Rome has a huge navy because they have massive trade all throughout the Mediterranean now. And with that navy and with their army, they blockade the city of Carthage for 3 years. And during those 3 years, the city of Carthage goes through famines, it goes through different diseases. They have a malaria outbreak, they have a typhus outbreak, because again, the more exhausted the body of people living in a small area together, the more likely disease is to set in. Um, so after 3 years, the city of Carthage finally submits. And the Roman army, in a very unchivalrous way, ravages the entire city. They destroy it, they burn it, and raze it to the ground. There's talk that the Romans sowed salt into the soil so that nothing could ever grow there again. We don't know if that's true. That's just a nice rumor. But it does make for a fun picture over here with Salt Bay. But what they do is they kill most of the men, the male population of the city of Carthage, and then they enslave all of the women and children and the men that they didn't kill. So a huge number of slaves are brought into Roman society through this as well. So what is the outcome of these Punic Wars? Is it just the defeat of Carthage? Not that that isn't enough. But the defeat of Carthage means that Rome was able to get a number of firsts accomplished. With the ceding of Sicily over to Rome during the First Punic War, Rome was able to establish its first province outside of the peninsula of Italy. So we have the first Roman provinces developed with Sicily, and then later with Spain, and then with Carthage itself. And that means that Rome now has total dominance of the Western Mediterranean, which eventually leads them to expand even further into the north, into present day France, which they know as Gaul, and then even into Britain. But the Punic Wars also bring Rome into conflict with the Hellenistic kingdoms and paved a way for even greater domination over the Eastern Mediterranean. Probably in a very regretful move, a Macedonian king had allied with the Carthaginians during the Second Punic War. And thus, so just like what Athens had done when they helped that Ionian revolt against the Persian Empire, when they sacked that Persian capital of Sardis, Macedonia drew the attention of Rome over to Greece in a way that they had never imagined what the consequences of that would be. So now we're going to talk about the third stage of Roman expansion, and that is the expansion into the Hellenistic kingdoms. And this happens from 200 to 133 BC. Rome, as I said, had its attention kind of drawn to Greece because of the role of this Macedonian king with the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. And this kind of brings up this idea that they do want to kind of expand into the Eastern Empire. Because again, that's a border of them. If you look at the map, their whole eastern side is this Greece coastline right here. And so it makes sense that they would want to shore that up and make sure defensively that they're covered. So in 200, we see the beginning of the Macedonian Wars. In 200, Rome conquers Macedonia, and initially it frees all of those Greek city-states from Macedonian control. Remember, Alexander the Great's dad, King Philip, he had taken all of those Greek cities under his control, and then Alexander did the same. And then after Alexander dies, we see his different generals kind of sharing, his empire. One of those empires was the Macedonian area of Greece. So Rome takes over Macedonia and then frees all those Greek city-states and makes them allies of Rome. So again, supposedly offering them these rights, giving them their own ability to rule themselves as long as they provide soldiers and are loyal to Rome. So they're offered these additional rights and just to work in Rome's interest. However, over time, there is a Greek rebellion against Roman rule in 146, and Rome comes in, and to make a point, just the way that Alexander the Great made his point with the city of Thebes, Rome makes a point and destroys 50 Greek cities. They completely sack and destroy the city of Corinth. and about 150,000 people are taken into slavery with this kind of defeat of the Greek city-states in 146. And then after that, Rome sort of moves into the Ionian Peninsula, so those Greek areas of Asia Minor, so over here. And they end up taking those areas around 186, so that part of the Seleucid kingdom. Remember, the Seleucid kingdom is essentially that old Persian Empire part, and it's big and it's hard to keep control of. So they lose this portion to the Romans in 186. And by 133, Asia Minor, that area, is officially a province, and it's being ruled by a Roman governor. Uh, and it's actually with this province of Asia that we have our first Roman governors appointed, because it is such a distance that communication isn't as easy. And actually, there is another kingdom in Greece that the king, when he died, just willed his kingdom to Rome rather than see Rome attack his kingdom. He just did a peaceful inheritance with them. So with the taking of these Greek lands and part of Asia Minor, we start seeing a lot more money flowing into Rome as well. And these governors, the first one being made the governor over Asia Minor, but then there's governors being placed over all of these different provinces. We see a governor in Sicily, we see a governor in Sardinia, a governor in Spain. There's a lot of wealth to be gained over being governor of these different provinces. And so it's seen as a very lucrative post, and also like a stepping stone to further advancement within the Roman governmental system. So Rome, essentially, with this conquering of these various areas that we see around the map here, has apparently removed the threat for the need of constant vigilance that it had thought it had by conquering all of its neighbors. And so even though Rome still thinks of itself as a republic, and a republic is really great at ruling a city-state, but in all reality, they are a giant empire now, and it's not as easy to rule an empire in the same fashion that you would rule a city-state. So we start seeing a number of issues happen within Roman society and within politics that are reflections of this change of Roman position and size. And Romans themselves are amazed by what Rome has accomplished in such a small period of time. And they're also very proud of their city and what they've done. And they start referring to the Mediterranean Sea as our sea, or as Mar Nostrum, our sea. And it kind of just shows the way that Rome views the rest of the world around them, that it's theirs for the taking. You know, they took it so easily. Why isn't the rest for their taking as well? But as I mentioned, this growth of the empire does result in a number of internal problems, and we're going to talk about those next. So some of these problems that Romans start having to face is we have the problem of the agrarian Italian countryside. We have a problem of slavery within the empire, or within the republic, excuse me. A problem within the cities, and especially inside Rome itself, and then problems that happen within the provinces. So we're going to talk about all of those in order. So the problems in the agrarian Italian countryside, initially it's not hard to explain. So remember the 20-year war during the Second Punic Wars, where Hannibal was marching his 30,000, 50,000 troops and war elephants up and down the Italian peninsula? Well, you don't imagine that the fields they were trampling over were very easy to just the next year we just replow and harvest. No, there was a lot of damage done by this 20-year war back and forth through the Italian countryside. And it really did a lot of damage. And some of the results of these long wars is really going to affect, beyond the fact that the fields were trampled. But if you remember, the early Romans really prided themselves on this idea that they were these farmer soldiers. And it started off with this simple agricultural economy. You know, the idea that the familia worked on the tract of land and worked together for the whole family. So this whole idea of these small farmers was very important to the Roman idea. And it it's important to that traditional system that Rome likes to tell itself that it's a part of. So to begin with, the Roman conquests make it possible for Rome and Italy to develop extensive trade networks across the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. And Roman contact with the East demands all of these luxury goods that Romans had not known about before. And Romans are paying for these goods with money that had been brought into Rome by conquest. And by 200 BC, it becomes harder and harder for these small farmers to make a living. Remember, all of this money is flowing in, and that's causing inflation, which makes it harder for the small farmers to sell their goods at a decent price. And so these small farmers are suffering for a variety of reasons. But the most important reason for this suffering, it really comes out of that Roman expansion and warfare. In the early period, most Roman soldiers were farmers, and they farmed in the winter and they fought in the summer. And this was easy since those wars when they were fighting in the Italian peninsula, they were close to home. They were able to get back when it was time to harvest and time to farm. But as the Romans begin fighting farther and farther away, say in Spain or in Sicily, in Greece or in Asia Minor or in North Africa, many of those soldiers are forced to stay away from their farms for years at a time, possibly. And so this near continuous warfare on Italian soil, especially during that Second Punic War I mentioned, left the Italian countryside in ruins. Farmlands, homes, equipment, livestock, fields had all been devastated and destroyed. So when these Roman soldiers, many of whom were farmers, when they return home, they're returning home to disastrous situations. And many of them lacked the money or the people to repair and restore those lands to something that could eventually be lucrative. So many of these farmers are forced to sell their lands, and they're forced to sell them at really low prices because they need the money to survive. So who in Rome had the money to buy up these cheap farms and those lands? Well, it's those wealthy patricians who kept getting wealthier with every war that happened. Those who were able to benefit from trade and the commercial growth of Roman Empire. So these patricians are able to start buying up all of this cheap land, and they create these gigantic estates that they call lutifundia, and essentially it's a plantation. So they're able to create these gigantic corporate farms that are worked on by slaves, by this cheap labor force. And because they have these giant farms and because they're farmed by slaves, they're able to sell their goods at a price that just puts out all of those other small farmers who had managed to stay in business. Their prices just put those small farmers out of business that just can't compete with the slave labor force. There's no competing against that. And so this situation becomes worse and worse, and eventually we have an entire class of landless citizen soldiers and their families who just start moving into Rome and other large cities in their areas and creating shanty towns because they don't have any money to buy houses or pay rent. And so it's just this entire class of landless citizen farmers and soldiers with no jobs and no income opportunities. And this puts a lot of increased pressure on the internal workings of the Roman Republic. So because we mentioned this, I do want to talk about slavery now, because it is a huge problem that comes up at this time. So slavery in the Roman territories grows as Rome grows. So in 250, it was estimated that about 10% of the population of Rome was made up of slaves. So 10% of Rome's population in 250 was slaves. But by 150 BC, 100 years later, a third of the population was slaves. And that's a gigantic increase to think about. The percent, it's about a third in Rome and in cities. The amount of slaves to Roman citizens in the countryside is a little bit less, but it's still a pretty high percentage. And to talk a little bit about Romans' opinion on slavery, Romans believed that inequality in power, freedom, and the control of resources was an accepted part of life. They believed that freedom was not a general right, but a select privilege. And it was believed that the freedom of some was only possible because others were enslaved. Slavery was not considered an evil. It was considered a necessity by Roman citizens. And the fact that slaves were made up of the losers in battles or in wars and their subsequent dependents and offspring, it was a helpful justification and confirmation of Rome's perceived cultural superiority and divine right to rule over others, and therefore to exploit those others for their absolute whatever their needs or purposes might be. So this idea of winning these slaves in war really gave Romans kind of this feeling of superiority that they had over them. You know, we're the victors and you are the losers, and therefore this is the world that you live in now. There was really no ethnic or territorial preference for taking slaves. It was mostly just who was conquered in those Roman wars. But as time goes on, there does become preferences in types of slaves from different types of ethnic groups. So Gauls and Celts and people of those Germanic tribes from the northern parts of Europe start to become preferred for their strength and endurance. And so they actually start getting used and employed by Roman military units to fight in the army in these auxiliary army roles. So they're soldier slaves, essentially. Or because of strength, they're put into these menial labor tasks like heavy mining or farming or other really labor intensive activities. When Greeks start being brought into the slave network, educated Greeks are very highly prized as slaves because of their cultural refinement and their education. So Greeks with the ability to educate and that were literate were really highly sought after to be tutors for Roman youths. And their knowledge of medicine was also really important and really valued as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how people got slaves. So there were slave markets in most of the large cities across Rome. Slaves were generally paraded around the cities with signs on their necks advertising their virtues. You know, if they were strong, if they were literate, if they had weaving skills or medicine skills, things like that. So advertisements, essentially. And slave owners, slave ownership really remained the prerogative of the wealthy. A more modest Roman business owner or artisan or military veteran would maybe own one or two slaves, whereas a very wealthy patrician could own hundreds, maybe even thousands of slaves if they owned a number of these plantations, these Lufundia plantations. But what's really important to understand is that these slaves were vital to the economy of Rome. Slaves worked in the households, they provided entertainment, they farmed the farms, they worked in the businesses, they were in the mines getting that silver and gold that was used for money. They essentially made the Roman Empire, the economy run. They were hugely important to the Roman economy. But unfortunately, they had no legal standing. They had no familial standing. They were considered chattel property. They were to be done with as their owner wished. A child born to a mother who was a slave was automatically a slave, regardless of who the father was. There was a path to manumission, a path to freedom, but that did not come with citizenship automatically, and it certainly was not easy. Only the children of a freed slave could have citizenship, but not a freed slave themselves. There's a lot of writing that was done at this time period about the best methods for managing slaves, talking about what type of food and clothing was best, what the most efficient methods of motivation was. Was it either through threat or through pain, or was it by giving time off and giving better food rations? Books that talked about how to create divisions amongst slaves so that they didn't form dangerous groups that could rise up. Lots of treatises written about this, and probably for good reason, because there were a number of organized slave revolts that happened during this time period, and these were referred to as the Servile Wars. The first occurred in Sicily in 135 BC, but the second Servile War is the one that most people are familiar with, and that was the one that was led by Spartacus in southern Italy in 73 BCE. Um, so for those who aren't familiar with the story, I'm going to just take a drink real quick. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator. So remember, Thrace is from the northern part of Greece. It's that country next to Macedonia, a little bit further to its east. So Spartacus was a Thracian soldier who was taken captive by the Romans and sold into slavery, and he was sold to a ludus, a gladiator school. So he was a gladiator school. He had previously served in that Roman army, as I said. But through this gladiator school, he becomes a leader of a slave rebellion that began at the gladiator school he was at in Capua, which is near present day Naples. And so to supplement the numbers of these gladiators, they took slaves from the surrounding countryside. So they freed a bunch of laborers, other people who weren't gladiators, they were just normal slaves. And they assembled an army numbering up to 70,000. And some of the numbers say they were at 120,000 even. And amazingly, this slave army successfully defeats two Roman armies in 73 BC. And then in 72 BC, Spartacus defeats both the Roman consuls, and he fought his way all the way to northern Italy. Just a huge success. Um, he gets all the way to the Bologna area of Italy. And this is where the rebellion is finally kind of crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus. And this happens in 71 BCE. Spartacus falls in this battle. There's about 6,000 survivors who are all captured by another Roman general named Pompey, who we'll learn more about later. And they're captured by Pompey's troops, and they are all crucified as a message to other Roman slaves that were hoping to win their freedom through violence. So it's a really bloody end to this rebellion, but it just shows how many slaves there were and what the danger of them rising up. Remember the Spartans who refused to leave Sparta for very long because of fear of the Helots rising up. This is what they were afraid of, and this is what could have happened. So it makes sense now. So the use of these slaves on those large farms in the Roman countryside resulted in the small plebeian soldier farmers not being able to compete against these giant plantation farms. And over time, this situation really destabilizes that fragile Roman class system. So the problems in the cities, what are these problems in the cities? So all of those families that are displaced from the countryside flock to Rome and other giant cities for protection and for employment. But they encounter the same problem in Rome that they encountered in the countryside. Those victorious wars and the resulting increased trade that Rome was now involved in throughout the known world resulted in many patricians becoming insanely wealthy. And one way for them to display that wealth was through the purchase of slaves to work in their households and to work in their business. So instead of employing good old Romans, they're employing slaves for free employment. And so this led to a dramatic increase in the number of slaves in the cities who are working jobs that used to be paid employment for normal Romans. So the city, but especially Rome, the cities, especially Rome, become increasingly filled with poor people who are homeless, jobless, and becoming angry and bitter and volatile. So it's a huge problem that results in this influx of slaves into the empire or into the republic. So the other problem that we have is the problem with the provinces. Remember, with the Punic Wars, we start seeing Rome developing their first provinces outside of the Italian peninsula. And the political institution that was in overall charge of the provinces was the Senate. And post-Punic Wars, the Senate really starts to become the real power in Rome, even though it's not supposed to have that much power. It's supposed to be the assemblies, but the power goes where the money goes. The main thing that the Senate wanted to ensure was that the provinces were stable and orderly. And for that reason, it usually kept Roman military forces in the provinces under the command of a general who would then usually serve as the province governor. The problem is that most of these governors, most of these generals tended to be relatives or friends of the senators. So they were put in those places not because of their merit, but because of who they were. And the overwhelming majority of these men were more interested in their own political futures back in Rome than they were in the provinces that they were governing. And so, in order to advance their political careers, they knew that they needed money. And so, they took that money from the province that they had been charged with overseeing. So, consequently, many of these governors collected more taxes than they were supposed to. They practiced extortion, blackmail. They provoked uprisings so they would have an excuse to loot and take things. So, in other words, there's just a massive amount of corruption in the Roman provinces. So all of these problems, the problems in the Italian countryside, the problems in the cities, the problems in the provinces, the problems with increased slavery within the Republic, all of these issues become worse. And just the tension becomes more and more of an issue. We have slave revolt happening in the countryside. There's food revolt happening in the cities. There's uprising in the provinces. And so the stability of the Republic really starts to decline. And next week, what we're going to talk about is the social reforms that Rome tries to enact to deal with these problems that are resulting of the growth of Rome. So we will turn to the turmoil of the first and second centuries and the social reforms of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic, and then into the empire. So thank you for watching, and we will see everyone back next week. I hope everyone is safe with the hurricanes coming, and please contact me if you have any problems. You won't get to the end of the video if you have problems watching the video, so I probably shouldn't say contact me if you have problems watching the video. Smart. All right. I hope everyone enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please let me know.